Thank you, Acting Deputy Chair. So, I rise to speak to the RRAT inquiry into the closure of branches in the regions. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the great work of my committee colleagues, in particular the Chair, Matt Canavan, who has done a very good job of raising this issue in the media, and also my other committee colleagues, in particular Linda White. She'll be sadly missed, and she was a great committee member. Glenn Stirl, Senator Colbeck, Senator Brockman, Senator Allman-Payne. I think it's fair to say that it was a very collegiate committee, and we all shared the same values, and that is that we believe that people out there in regional and metropolitan Australia are entitled to have access to banking services. And indeed, the first recommendation of the committee was that it is time that it is recognised in this country that banking is an essential service. That is very, very important, because like all other essential services in this country, you have to have a public-private setup. So in hospitals, you have public hospitals and you have private hospitals. With schools, you have public schools and you have private schools. And it is time we recognise that in banking, we also need a public bank. The sale of the Commonwealth Bank did not increase competition. It actually concentrated market powers. And the Commonwealth Bank, it was actually set up by the Labor Party and Andrew Fisher and King O'Malley way back, I think it was around 1911 or 1913. I'll stand to be corrected on one of those dates. And it was designed, it actually started off as a central bank as well, and it actually funded many infrastructure projects across the country. But I won't dwell on the infrastructure bank project issue now. But then and then eventually that Commonwealth Bank, the national bank aspect of it got segregated, and then also the Reserve Bank side of it got segregated in 1959, and then eventually the RBA side of it got, the responsibilities of the RBA were again segregated in the 90s with ARPRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, being separated from the RBA. And that's a shame, because what we've got now is a situation where too many cooks spoil the broth. I don't think ARPRA's done a very good job at all of enforcing the voluntary code of conduct that was implemented 20 years ago that said that the last bank in town has to keep that branch open. And that's one of the things that we heard from many constituents, is that major banks were closing down branches without actually consulting the community. And indeed, one of the recommendations of this report is that we now introduce a mandatory code of conduct, and that banks are actually forced to consult with ARPRA if they close a branch down in a regional town or a metropolitan area. Now, I have to be honest, I think the horse is bolted on that one, but it is still a recommendation that I think we should still implement just as an extra safeguard, but it is something that must be done. And it's important to understand, I just want to identify the vulnerable communities out there that need face-to-face banking. First of all, the retirees. Many retirees aren't comfortable using computer services, using computers. They're afraid of scams. And it's not just retirees who weren't necessarily tech-savvy in the beginning. I've spoken to retirees who are tech-savvy, but as they get older, they get Alzheimer's, or they get Parkinson's, or their eyesight isn't as good, and they're not as comfortable as using a mouse and reading the computer, and they're not as sharp as, say, they were once. Because I've got to admit, some of the spam emails that go around, it is very easy to be confused. And we owe it to our retirees to make sure that they can go to a branch and actually get service, face-to-face service, and build up a customer relationship with the bank. A bank that takes their money at, say, 1 or 2% and then lends it out at 5 or 6%. So that bank has an obligation, if they're going to hold these people's money on their account and pay them a very low rate of interest, which is often what they do. There's billions of dollars out there on very low interest accounts. They have an obligation to make sure that they deliver a service in return for getting the benefit of lending that money on at a higher interest rate. Now, A second very, very important part of the community that relies on branches, bank branches, of course, is small businesses. And they need access to banks for a number of reasons, not the least of which is cash. Cash is still a important part of our economy. And no one for a minute is doubting that we're going to go electronic, but there is always a time and a place for some cash transactions. Some people want to use cash all the time. I myself can live with using electronic payments, but I must admit at times it is convenient to have cash, especially if you're a tourist. And that's one of the things we heard from Port Douglas, for example. As many tourists go up to Port Douglas, I think they have something like 500,000 visitors a year, and the branches are closing, aren't open 5 days a week from 9 till 5 o'clock. So often the tourists who need cash or might have to finish off a banking transaction if they're on holiday from Sydney need access to a bank branch. So they're another vulnerable community. The other, another community that's very important are community groups. They hold, fates, things like that. They also, I know myself, I was president of my son's school's P&F. We had to change all the signatures, and it was quite a kerfuffle. I mean, I was living in town at the time, and it was quite a kerfuffle just to get us to all meet at the same place at the same time. We've heard stories of where people have had to organise a 200-kilometre or 300-kilometre round trip to go to another town to sign signatures, whether it's a school P&F or some other volunteer organisation. They need a bank branch. Another community that needs support, of course, are immigrants. They don't always speak English very well when they arrive here. They're not necessarily comfortable reading all the terms and conditions and using, say, an English-based internet front end. So they also would like to go and speak to a teller face-to-face to make sure they can get important personal service. So these are some of the vulnerable groups that have been impacted by banks that rip out $30 billion of profits a year. And my time's about to end, so I just want to run on to the recommendations. I'm very glad the first recommendation was that banking is an essential service, and a part of that, of course, is the public bank. Now, if we want to make a public bank work, we actually have to make sure that the RBA, I'm not a big fan of the current bank at post system at the moment, whereby the post office franchisees are required to provide various banking services for the various major banks. I don't think the major banks, and this is something that we learnt in the inquiry, are actually paying the post office franchisees enough, number one, and then the franchisees are expected, the post office is expected to understand all the different nuances of all the different banks and their products. I would much rather we had a government account whereby basically and it's backed, and the services and those payment systems are actually underpinned by the RBA. I've just recently been on a public works inquiry at the RBA head office in Sydney, and I was actually fortunate enough to be able to speak to the RBA Governor Michelle Bullock, and the RBA still manage the payment systems today. So we've already got post offices out there that have the physical infrastructure. We've got an RBA with an electronic infrastructure. We can combine those two to provide a bank. And if we could somehow turn our post office into a bank, and quite frankly, I'll throw this in as well as a government insurance office. We should never privatise the state government insurance offices. We could have a one-stop government-owned financial services hub that provides banking services, insurance services and post office services, and even combine it with Centrelink services whereby people can go in, a bit like a New South Wales model, where they can go in and they can get access to all the necessary government services and in one place. And the money that can be used from the profit, because we'd obviously have to underwrite a certain rate of return so that we didn't take away the private bank's profit. But let the private banks rip by all means, but we need a public bank to maintain an ethical competition as well, because I have no doubt that the privatisation of the CBA in the 1990s and the introduction of superannuation led to the actual Royal Commission into financial misconduct in financial services. And that was because we didn't have a public bank to keep a lid on unethical practices engaged by the private banks. So I'd like to thank everyone that has supported this committee and this inquiry, and I strongly encourage the current government of the day to take these recommendations seriously, and I seek leave to continue my remarks.
Authorised G. Rennick People First Chermside.